For most, Halloween was a night of costumes, candy, and laughter. But for Ben and his younger sister Sophie, it was the night their small town's legend came alive. They lived in Gray Hollow, an old town nestled in fog-cloaked hills where everyone knew the story of Ethel Kane. She was a reclusive woman who, as legend told it, lost her mind after her son vanished in the woods on Halloween night decades ago. She'd gone to the police, her neighbors, and even to the church, but no one had seen the boy. Eventually, in her desperation, Ethel took to wandering the town, clawing at windows, scratching doors, and muttering, "He's in the trees. My boy's in the trees." No one had ever seen her again after that night, but every Halloween, locals claimed they could hear her mournful wail echoing from the forest's edge. Ben didn't believe in ghosts, but Sophie did. She clutched his arm as they joined a group of friends near the forest. "Ben, promise you won't leave me alone," she whispered, glancing nervously at the tall, skeletal trees. Ben chuckled. "Soph, there's no ghost. It's just an old story people tell to scare kids like you." One of their friends, Leo, smirked. "If you're so brave, Ben, why don't we go see if we can find Ethel?" Ben rolled his eyes, but he couldn't resist. "Fine, let's go." Together, they ventured into the woods, laughing and pretending not to notice the deepening shadows. But Sophie stayed close, eyes darting around as if the trees might suddenly come to life. As they walked further, their laughter faded. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and an unsettling silence fell over them. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" asked Emma, another friend, her voice trembling. "Scared, Emma?" Leo teased, but his voice had lost its usual bravado. They had just decided to turn back when Sophie gasped. "Did you hear that?" Her face went pale as she stared into the darkness. Everyone froze, straining to listen. A soft rustling, like something dragging across dry leaves, echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods. "It's probably just an animal," Ben said, but even he couldn't ignore the prickling at the back of his neck. Then they heard it, a low, guttural voice, barely a whisper but clear as day. "My boy, he's here." Emma grabbed Ben's arm. That's just someone playing a trick, right?" But no one was laughing. The voice sounded wrong, ancient and broken, like a creaking door that hadn't been opened in years. Ben forced a grin. "All right, we've had our fun. Let's get out of here." They turned back, but the trees seemed closer than before, the path darker, as if the forest itself was shifting. And then, as if out of nowhere, they saw her. A woman stood on the path. Her clothes were tattered, hair a tangled mass of gray. She was barefoot, skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her hollow eyes fixated on them, her lips moving soundlessly. Everyone froze, paralyzed with fear as her mouth opened wider, an unnatural grin stretching across her face. "Have you seen my son?" Her voice was no more than a rasp. Sophie whimpered, clutching Ben's arm. Ben tried to pull her back, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. "Ma'am, we're just leaving," he managed to stammer. But the woman tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. "They all leave, but he stayed. He's still here. Do you hear him?" Her gaze drifted to the trees, and as she spoke, they heard something else. A child's laughter, faint but distinct, weaving through the branches. Leo stumbled back. "This isn't funny. We need to go." But the woman was already moving, her bony fingers reaching toward them. "No one leaves the woods. They all come back to me." Ben grabbed Sophie's hand, yanking her away. "Run." They tore down the path, hearts pounding, the woman's whispers echoing after them. The forest seemed endless, the path looping back on itself. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper, and always the whispers followed, louder now, relentless. Emma stumbled, and Leo helped her up, but Ben hardly noticed. He had one focus, keeping Sophie safe. But as he glanced back, his heart dropped. Sophie wasn't there. "Sophie!" he shouted, his voice raw. "Sophie!" The forest swallowed his voice, silence falling like a suffocating blanket. "Ben!" It was Sophie's voice, faint and far off. He spun around, trying to trace the sound. "Ben, help me!" Without thinking, he ran toward her voice, deeper into the dark. And then he saw her, standing by a towering oak, her eyes wide with fear. But as he rushed to her, he froze. She was looking at something behind him. Slowly, he turned. There stood Ethel Kane, her face inches from his, her eyes filled with a grief so consuming it felt like it might devour him whole. "He's here," she whispered, her voice carrying a sinister calm. "But he won't leave me." Ben stumbled back, grabbing Sophie, and as he did, something in the branches above moved. They looked up, and there, staring down with empty eyes, was a boy, no older than 10. His face was pale, skin translucent, and his mouth twisted in a smile too wide for his small face. The boy tilted his head, his gaze locking onto Sophie. "Come play with me," he whispered. Sophie's hand slipped from Ben's as if in a trance, her face blank, eyes glazed. "No!" Ben screamed, grabbing her and pulling her back. "She's mine!" Ethel hissed, reaching for Sophie, her fingers grazing Ben's shoulder. They burned like ice, numbing his skin. Summoning every ounce of strength, Ben yanked Sophie away, stumbling backward, feeling as though invisible hands clawed at him, desperate to drag them both into the shadows. They broke through the trees, gasping, collapsing onto the grassy edge of the forest. Behind them, the woods were silent, their friends gone, the whispers gone. The night was eerily still. But Ben knew it wasn't over. As they caught their breath, Sophie turned to him, her face pale. "Ben," she whispered something to me. Ben's stomach churned. What did she say? Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "She said, if you ever come back, you'll stay forever." The next morning, police searched the woods and found Leo and Emma's jackets, lying in a neat pile beneath the towering oak. There was no sign of their friends, just a faint, cold breeze that carried a soft, childlike laugh. Ben and Sophie never spoke of that Halloween again, but every year as the leaves turned and the air grew cold, they would hear it, just faintly, just for a moment, the sound of a boy's laughter in the trees. And they would remember Ethel's final, chilling words, "No one leaves the woods." It was supposed to be a simple job, 2 nights in the old Markham house, take photos, document any paranormal activity, and collect a nice fee from Mr. Devereaux, a real estate developer looking to sell the decrepit place. A few internet rumors about ghosts had kept buyers away, and Mr. Devereaux wasn't pleased. To prove it was nothing but superstitions, he hired Pete and Diane, a couple who specialized in disproving hauntings for money. They'd been to dozens of supposedly haunted places, always boring, always quiet, but not the Markham house. From the moment they arrived, Pete had an uneasy feeling. The house loomed over them, its sagging roof and shattered windows giving it a face of sorts, like an old man glaring down at them. Diane, ever the pragmatist, brushed it off. "It's just a house, Pete," she muttered, adjusting her camera gear. "We'll get in, do our job, and be out by Monday." The first night was uneventful, creaks, groans, the usual sounds an old house made. But at 3:33 a.m., something changed. Diane was in the living room, setting up a night vision camera, when she heard a faint hum, like a child singing a lullaby. She froze, her hand tightening on the camera. Pete was upstairs and she was alone. "Pete?" she called out. Her voice seemed to fall flat, swallowed by the silence. Footsteps echoed down the hall. They were small, soft, nothing like Pete's heavy tread. Diane's heart pounded. She glanced at the stairs, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, moving closer, until they stopped right in front of her. She could feel a chill in the air, a presence, as though something was watching her. Then she heard it again, closer this time, a whisper so soft she could barely make it out. "Where is she?" Diane staggered back, nearly dropping her camera. The whisper was so close, so desperate. She stumbled back to the staircase, where Pete was finally coming down, looking annoyed. "What's going on?" he asked, frowning. "There's someone here," Diane whispered, her voice shaking. She told him about the footsteps, the whisper, the strange, cold presence. But Pete just rolled his eyes. "It's an old house, Diane. You're letting the stories get to you." Annoyed, Diane shook her head and went upstairs, leaving Pete to set up the cameras. But as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced back and, for just a moment, saw a small shadow dart across the hallway. It was the size of a child. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No answer. She turned back, but the shadow was gone. Trying to ignore the icy knot in her stomach, she hurried to the room they decided to sleep in, a small bedroom with peeling wallpaper and an old, musty mattress. The night passed in fitful sleep, filled with strange dreams of children crying, of doors creaking open by themselves, and always that faint, haunting hum of the lullaby echoed in her mind. The next morning, Diane woke up alone. Pete was gone, his side of the bed cold. She got up, calling his name, but the house was silent. Panic set in. She searched every room, every closet, but there was no sign of him. Then, as she passed by a dusty mirror in the hallway, she saw something that stopped her cold. There, written in the dust, was a message, scrawled in a childlike hand, "She's mine now." Diane stumbled back, her heart racing. She rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. She tried the windows, but they were all stuck, as if welded shut. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she realized she was trapped. "Pete!" she screamed, pounding on the door. "Pete, where are you?" The only answer was that eerie, childlike hum growing louder, filling the house with its haunting melody. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, she heard Pete's voice. "Diane, Diane, help me." She followed the voice, her heart racing as she descended into the basement. It was dark, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. But Pete's voice was unmistakable, calling her name over and over. "Pete, Pete, where are you?" she called, her voice shaking. The hum grew louder, echoing off the damp walls. And then she saw him. Pete was standing in the corner, his back to her, his head bowed. Relief flooded through her, and she ran to him, reaching out to touch his shoulder. But as her hand made contact, he turned. His face was pale, his eyes vacant, his mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. He began to hum the lullaby, his voice hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside him. "Pete?" she whispered, her hand shaking. He grinned wider, and in a voice that was not his own, he whispered, "She's mine now." Diane screamed, stumbling back, her heart pounding as Pete, or whatever had taken over him, began to laugh, a cold, soulless sound that echoed through the basement. Suddenly the lights flickered, and she saw them. Small, shadowy figures, children with hollow eyes standing all around her. They were watching her, their faces twisted in sorrow, mouths moving in silent cries. "Help us," one of them whispered, reaching out a hand. But as Diane reached out, a cold hand gripped her wrist. She looked down to see Pete's hand, icy and stiff, holding her in place. "She's mine," he whispered again, his face inches from hers. The shadows began to close in, their cries filling her ears, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. She tried to scream, but no sound came out as the darkness swallowed her whole. 2 days later, Mr. Devereaux came to the Markham house, expecting to meet Pete and Diane. But the house was silent, empty. Their equipment lay scattered around, and a single message was scrawled in the dust of the living room floor. "She's mine now." Mr. Devereaux turned and fled, but as he left, he could have sworn he heard a faint, childlike hum following him, drifting from the darkened windows. And though he never went back, every Halloween, locals say they can hear that same hum drifting from the house, the haunting melody of a lullaby that never fades, as the souls of those trapped inside beg for release. Dr. Alec Morgan was a well-respected psychiatrist, known for his work with the most disturbed patients. He had seen it all: schizophrenia, dissociative identities, and dark cases no one else could handle. So when he was asked to take on Eva, a young woman who had been found wandering in the woods, disheveled and speaking in a language no one could identify, he agreed. The police reports said she was found near the old Marrow family home, a mansion with a reputation as the most haunted place in the state. The Marrows had all disappeared without a trace decades ago, and the house had stood empty ever since. Alec was a skeptic, convinced that ghosts and spirits were nothing more than the stuff of local legends. But Eva was different. He met her on a cold October evening. She sat in the corner of her cell, hair tangled, her once white dress stained and torn. She didn't look up when he entered, only muttered under her breath in that strange language. "Eva?" Alec's voice was calm, professional. "I'm Dr. Morgan. I'm here to help you." Her muttering stopped abruptly. Slowly she looked up, and he was struck by her eyes, dark, unblinking, filled with an intelligence that felt wrong somehow. Too aware, as though something else was looking at him through her. "Do you understand me?" he asked. She stared at him, silent, and then a slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face. "They're waiting, doctor," she said in perfect English, her voice soft but dripping with malice. "They'll come for you soon." A chill prickled the back of his neck, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Who's waiting, Eva?" She tilted her head, her smile growing wider. "The ones who whisper in the dark. They called me, and soon they'll call you too." He shook it off as theatrics, just the delusions of a disturbed mind. But that night, he found it difficult to sleep. He couldn't shake the memory of her eyes, the way they seemed to pierce right through him. The next morning, he returned to her cell, determined to get to the bottom of her story. He found her in the same spot, staring at the wall, her body as still as stone. "Eva," he began, settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me about the Marrow house. Why were you there?" She didn't respond for a long time. Then, in a low, sing-song voice, she began to chant. Once there were 3, but now there are none. They play in the dark, but the game's never done. Alec frowned. What does that mean? She looked at him, her expression blank. You'll see them soon enough, Doctor. They're already watching. Alec felt a cold draft sweep through the room. Even though the door was closed, he glanced behind him, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of the room, something tall and thin, with eyes that glinted like black mirrors. He turned back to Eva, but she was staring at the same spot, her eyes wide. Do you see it? She whispered. There's nothing there, he replied, though his voice was shakier than he would have liked. She smiled, that same eerie smile. They like you, Doctor. They've decided to keep you. Alec shuddered, the rational part of him insisting that it was just a trick, just the words of a troubled girl. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was lurking just beyond his vision. That night, he returned home, exhausted but unable to sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying Eva's words over and over. They like you, Doctor. They've decided to keep you. Around midnight, he heard a creak in the hallway. His breath caught as he sat up, listening intently. Another creak, this time closer. Heart pounding, he rose from his bed and opened the door, peering into the darkness. The hallway was empty. He took a deep breath, feeling foolish, and turned to go back to bed. And then he saw it. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure, tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a ghastly mask of shadows with 2 eyes that shone like polished onyx. It grinned at him, lips peeling back to reveal rows of jagged, 2 white teeth. Alex stumbled backward, a scream caught in his throat. The figure moved, gliding toward him without a sound, its bony fingers stretching out, reaching for him. He slammed the door shut, locking it, his hands shaking. But as he backed away, he felt a presence behind him. He turned, and there it was, another figure, identical to the first, grinning at him with those same hollow, hungry eyes. Alex screamed, the sound echoing through the house. He ran from room to room, but each time he opened a door, another figure would be waiting, silent, smiling, and reaching for him. Finally, he stumbled into the kitchen, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed a knife, clutching it tightly as he backed into a corner. But the figures didn't follow him into the kitchen. They stood at the doorway, watching him with those dark, glistening eyes. Then one of them spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that sent shivers down his spine. She warned you, Doctor. We're here, and we're never leaving. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, they were gone. Alec didn't sleep that night or the next. He returned to the hospital, desperate to speak with Eva to demand an explanation. But when he arrived, he was met with a grim silence. The guard at the front desk looked at him with a sad expression. Doctor, Eva passed away last night. They found her curled up in the corner of her cell. Smiling, she seemed at peace. Alec's blood ran cold. He stumbled back, feeling the weight of her words settle on him. She had warned him. And now he was alone with them. He returned home, hoping that somehow he could escape them, but they were always there, watching him, following him, haunting him. And every night, as the clock struck midnight, he would hear them whispering in the dark, calling his name, their voices cold and hungry, like fingers reaching into his soul. They were there, just out of sight, just beyond the shadows, waiting, always waiting. And as he lay in bed, clutching the covers, Alec knew the terrible truth. They would never leave him, not until he was as hollow, as empty, as they were. No one saw Dr. Alec Morgan again. His house stood empty, its windows dark, but locals claimed that if you passed by late at night, you could see shadows moving in the windows. Figures, silent and watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to come too close. And on cold October nights, if you listened closely, you could hear Alec's whispers joining theirs, pleading for escape from the darkness that would never let him go. Jacob was a loner. He spent his nights working on photography projects, capturing eerie, empty streets and decaying buildings around his city. It was a hobby that had turned into an obsession, one that he'd chased through moonlit alleys, old factories, and abandoned lots. But one night, he found himself pulled to a part of town he'd never visited, the industrial ruins on the edge of the city. He'd heard stories about it, a complex of factories long closed, fenced off, and forgotten. It was known to locals as the Candler District, and it was a place most people avoided. Workers had died in that factory years ago, the whispers said, under suspicious circumstances, and strange sounds were often heard echoing through the halls late at night. Jacob, always up for something eerie, took his camera and headed there. The entrance was uninviting, to say the least. The gate was sealed with rusted chains, but one of the factory windows had been smashed, giving him an entry point. He slid through the broken glass, landing softly on the dusty floor inside. His flashlight cast long shadows across the old machines and empty assembly lines, all coated in a layer of grime. There was a strange stillness to the place. The air felt thick, damp, and cold, the kind of cold that seemed to settle deep into your bones. Ignoring the shiver that ran down his spine, Jacob set up his camera. As he clicked the first shot, he thought he heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere down the hallway. "Just the wind," he whispered to himself, though his voice felt hollow. He took a few more photos, then moved toward the hallway. The tapping continued, louder now, but oddly precise, almost intentional. He followed it, his flashlight casting faint circles of light onto peeling walls and shattered windows. As he moved deeper, he noticed faded posters from decades ago, warning workers of the dangers of the machinery, and plastered with words like caution and danger. The tapping grew louder, sharper, and as he turned the corner, he froze. There was a man standing in the hallway, facing away from him. He was dressed in an old, dust-covered suit that looked like it hadn't been worn by anyone in decades. His head hung low, shoulders hunched, and his hand was tapping rhythmically against the metal wall beside him in a slow, steady beat. "Sir?" Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. The man stopped tapping, his head tilting slightly as though he'd heard Jacob but wasn't sure where the sound had come from. The hallway was dark, too dark, and Jacob's flashlight felt small, barely penetrating the shadows. "Excuse me," he tried again, louder this time. The man turned slowly, and Jacob felt his heart seize. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but there was something wrong with the way he moved, as though his joints were stiff, brittle, moving in short, jerky motions. The man's face was a ghastly shade of gray, his eyes sunken, hollow, staring straight through Jacob as if he wasn't there. Jacob took a step back, heart pounding, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. Why are you here?" he stammered, hoping for some kind of response. The man's head tilted again, and he raised one hand, pointing down the hallway toward an open door that led into a larger, darker room. He didn't speak. He simply pointed, his finger trembling slightly, before his arm fell limply back to his side. Jacob's pulse raced. He could leave, something deep in him screamed to run, but he couldn't turn away. Instead, he took a shaky breath, steeled himself, and moved toward the open door. He glanced back, but the man was gone, the hallway empty, the rhythmic tapping now silent. The room beyond was vast, filled with old equipment, conveyor belts, and towering stacks of crates that had been left behind. In the center of the room stood a large, rusted machine. It looked like a press of some sort, tall and foreboding, looming over the silent space like a mechanical giant. Jacob lifted his camera, snapping photos of the machine. But as the flash lit up the room, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Shapes, shadows, standing behind the machine, barely visible, watching him. His heart skipped a beat, and he lowered his camera. The shadows were gone, but the eerie silence had deepened, thickening the air with an almost tangible sense of dread. And then he heard it, a faint, wet, squelching sound coming from behind the machine. It was the kind of sound flesh makes when torn from bone. A chill crawled up Jacob's spine, but he forced himself forward. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he approached the machine, its beam barely illuminating the darkness around him. There, on the ground, lay a hand, decayed, gray, and severed at the wrist, like it had been ripped off. He stumbled back, but as he did, he heard a voice. It was faint, raspy, echoing from somewhere behind him. "They never left, you know." Jacob spun around, but saw no one. The voice continued, now closer, and he felt hot breath against his ear. "The workers, they're still here, waiting for someone to finish the job." Jacob's heart pounded as he saw movement from the shadows around him. Shapes began to emerge, more figures in tattered suits and dresses, each one bearing the decayed remnants of life, their eyes hollow and blank. Their faces were twisted in expressions of agony, mouths frozen mid-scream as if in their last moments of pain. He backed away, but the figures were all around him now, closing in, surrounding him. One of them, A woman with half her face missing reached out to him, her bony fingers grazing his arm. Her touch was like ice, numbing his skin, seeping into his bones. "Stay with us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Jacob tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room spun, the shadows swallowing him as the figures closed in, their skeletal hands reaching for him, pulling him toward the rusted machine. As he struggled, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a cracked, filthy window. He looked pale, his eyes hollow, skin stretched tight over his face, like the others around him. "No, please, I'm not like you," he gasped, struggling against their iron grip. But their fingers dug deeper, pulling him closer to the machine. The last thing he saw was the lever on the machine being pulled, the press beginning its slow descent and the gleaming metal moving toward him. The next day, his camera was found near the entrance, along with a single photo left on the memory card. It showed Jacob's face, twisted in horror, with shadowy figures all around him, their empty eyes watching, waiting. No one knew what happened to him, but locals say that if you listen carefully near the old Candler district on a quiet night, you can hear the sound of tapping echoing through the empty halls, the rhythmic beat of the lost souls who never left, waiting for their next visitor. Mira loved finding old, forgotten things. She scoured antique shops and thrift stores for unusual items, especially journals and diaries, fascinated by the glimpses they offered into other lives. So when she stumbled upon an antique store on a remote road one autumn afternoon, she couldn't resist. The shop was a labyrinth of dusty shelves and cluttered aisles, dimly lit and filled with a faint, musty smell. As she browsed, Mira's fingers traced over stacks of crumbling books, chipped porcelain dolls, and faded photographs. Then she saw it. Hidden at the back of a shelf, buried beneath other discarded objects, was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn, tied shut with a faded black ribbon. She picked it up, immediately feeling a strange pull. The name on the first page was barely legible, Eliza Monroe, 1932. The handwriting was delicate but shaky, as though written by someone who had seen more than her share of life's hardships. Curious, Mira brought the diary to the counter. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing eyes, watched her closely. "You don't want that," the woman said softly, her voice carrying an odd mix of warning and pity. "Why not?" Mira asked, feeling a chill despite the shop's warmth. The woman's gaze darkened. "Some things are better left alone." But Mira's curiosity was too strong. She purchased the diary and left, brushing off the shopkeeper's warnings as superstition. Back in her apartment that night, she untied the ribbon and opened the diary. The entries started innocently enough, mundane notes about Eliza's daily life, her loneliness, and her strange dreams. But as she read on, the entries became increasingly erratic, the writing disjointed, filled with feverish scratches and desperate pleas. October 11th, 1932, there's something wrong in this house. At night, I hear whispers in the walls, voices calling my name, soft but insistent. It started as a trickle, faint, but it's growing louder. They want something. They want me. Mira shivered, the words seeming to crawl off the page and settle in the room around her. She continued reading, drawn in despite the growing unease gnawing at her. October 18th, 1932. The voices are no longer just at night. They follow me through the house, whispering my name, telling me things I cannot bear to hear. They are waiting for me to finish something, to remember. Mira flipped to the next entry, her breath catching as she noticed that the handwriting had changed. The letters were jagged, almost angry, as if written by a trembling hand. October 22nd, 1932. I saw her today. A girl standing in the corner of my room. She looked just like me, but her eyes, they were hollow, empty, and her mouth was twisted in a cruel smile. She whispered to me, "Soon you will remember." Mira's heart began to race, but she was too enthralled to stop. She felt as though Eliza's fear was leaching into her, growing in her chest like a shadow. October 30th, 1932. The girl in the mirror. She's me, but not me. She's watching, always watching. When I sleep, I feel her standing beside my bed, her cold breath on my face. I can't escape her. She says I did something terrible, that I must pay. The room felt colder now, shadows creeping along the walls. Mira could almost feel a presence, as though someone or something was standing right behind her. She shook it off, blaming her imagination, and turned the page. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1932. Tonight is the night, she said. I must remember that I did this to her, and now I must make it right. She's coming. I can feel her. At the bottom of the page was a strange symbol, scratched into the paper, a spiral, with jagged lines radiating from it, like twisted arms reaching out. Just then, Mira felt a whisper of cold air against her neck, almost like breath. She froze, her body stiff with dread. Slowly, she looked up and caught sight of her reflection in the mirror across the room. But it wasn't her. The face staring back at her had the same features, but the eyes were dark, sunken, and hollow, filled with a malice that twisted her reflection into a cruel smile. Her heart thundered in her chest as her reflection leaned closer, its lips moving silently. Then Mira heard it, a voice in her mind, clear as a bell, yet icy and filled with anger. "You've read it now," the reflection said, though Mira's own mouth remained closed. "You know the truth." "What truth?" Mira stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "You did this to me," the reflection hissed. "You made me forget, but I remember now. And now, I'm coming for you." Mira felt her throat tighten, her pulse hammering wildly as her reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the mirror's surface. She couldn't move, her body paralyzed with terror as her reflection's hand passed through the glass, its fingers stretching out toward her. She stumbled back, the diary slipping from her hands as the figure stepped through the mirror, dragging the room into a dark, twisted reflection of itself. Shadows writhed on the walls, and the air was thick with a suffocating, icy chill. Mira backed into the corner, her heart racing as the figure closed in, its hollow eyes burning with rage. "You tried to forget, but I am still here," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "And now you'll remember every terrible thing you did to me." The figure's hand was inches from her face, cold and dark, reaching toward her like a predator closing in on its prey. Mira screamed, her voice echoing through the empty apartment, but no one heard her. The next morning, the police found her apartment empty, the only sign of her being the open diary on the floor, its last pages scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. "She's back. She remembers. And she will never leave me alone."